the village of Katoomba lay nestled in the heart of the savannah, where the earth was crimson and the sky stretched endlessly overhead like a cloth woven by the hands of creation itself. This was a place where the boundaries between the seen and unseen worlds grew thin as morning mist, where ancestors whispered through the acacia trees, and where the old stories still held power over the hearts of those who listened. But in this village, there lived a boy named Kofi who had forgotten how to listen to stories. He had forgotten, too, how to feel hope. Kofi was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, though hunger had made him appear smaller than his seasons deserved. His ribs pressed against his skin like the strings of a kora beneath cloth, and his eyes carried the weariness of someone who had learned early that the world did not always provide for the young. His mother had passed when he was barely able to walk, and his father had followed her into the spirit realm when Kofi was 5. Since then, he had belonged to his uncle's household, though belonging is perhaps too generous a word for the position he occupied. His uncle, a man named Obinna, was a merchant of considerable means. Obinna kept a warehouse of grain that could have fed the entire village twice over through the lean seasons. His compound was the largest in Katoomba, with walls of mud brick that gleamed in the afternoon sun, and a roof of thatch so thick and perfectly arranged that not even the fiercest rains could penetrate it. Obinna had 3 sons of his own, and they were fed so well that their cheeks rounded like the fruits of the mango tree, and their laughter rang out across the compound like the bells of a celebration. Kofi slept in the storage room behind the main house, on a mat thin enough to feel the earth beneath it. He was given 1 meal a day, usually scraps from what the family had eaten the evening before, leftovers that had begun to sour or turn hard. His uncle's reasoning, which he stated plainly and without shame, was that Kofi was not his blood son, and therefore not his responsibility. The boy was fed enough to work, and that was sufficient. And so Kofi worked. From before the sun rose until long after it had descended beyond the distant acacia forests, the boy labored. He carried water from the well in clay pots that grew heavier each time he filled them. He swept the compound, pulling a bundle of dried grasses across the earth until his small hands blistered and bled. He tended the goats and chickens, mucking out their enclosures and repairing the fences when they loosened. He hauled firewood from the forest, stacking it in neat piles that his uncle never thanked him for assembling. There were nights when Kofi's stomach hurt so much that he could not sleep. He would lie on his thin mat, curled like a question mark, and listen to the sounds of the village settling into slumber. He heard the distant drums of the griot's house, where stories were being told to families gathered in the cool evening air. He heard the gentle lowing of cattle being settled for the night, and the chirp of insects that seemed to sing more sweetly than any voice he had ever heard. And sometimes in those quiet hours, he wondered if his mother could see him from the spirit realm, if she was disappointed in the boy he had become, a boy with no hope and no future, merely a body moving through the motions of survival. But Kofi still possessed one thing that his uncle could not take from him, though he had certainly tried. He possessed a capacity for kindness that had not been beaten or starved out of him. It lived in him like a small flame, carefully protected from the wind of hardship, and it flickered brightest in the moments when he might have turned cruel and did not. This quality would soon be tested in ways that Kofi could not have imagined. The dry season had come to Katoomba with unusual ferocity that year. The rains, which were supposed to fall in abundance, had delayed themselves beyond the time of their coming. The earth became hard and cracked like old pottery. The well, which had never run dry in the memory of the oldest elders, began to drop, its water retreating deeper and deeper beneath the surface as if fleeing to some hidden chamber of the world. Farmers stood in their fields and watched their crops wither. The leaves of the baobab trees began to curl and fall, and with each passing day the village grew hungrier. Obinna's stores of grain became the most precious commodity in Katoomba. Families who had always possessed dignity came to his door with requests, with pleas, with desperate bargaining. And Obinna, whose heart had grown as hard and dry as the earth itself, refused almost all of them. He set prices so high that only the richest families could afford his grain. He bought more from distant villages, bringing it in on the backs of donkeys, not to distribute it but to hoard it, betting that the prices would continue to rise as desperation increased. Kofi watched this unfold with a heaviness in his chest. He saw children with distended bellies being carried through the streets by mothers whose eyes had become like empty wells themselves. He saw old men and women sitting beneath the trees, their bones visible beneath paper-thin skin, waiting with silent patience for death to come and collect them. And he saw his uncle sitting in his compound, counting money, unconcerned with the suffering beyond his walls. The boy's own hunger intensified during this time. His single meal a day diminished to even smaller portions, as his uncle decided that there was no need to feed him well during a scarcity. Kofi began to eat whatever he could find. He chewed on tree bark when he thought no one was watching. He collected insects, grasshoppers and grubs, and consumed them raw, too weak to build a fire without drawing attention. He drank water from puddles and from the river, even as the river itself began to fail. He was surviving but barely, and with each day that passed, his strength diminished further. It was during this time of profound hunger that something shifted within the village. Stories began to spread, whispered from elder to elder, from grandmother to grandchild, during the brief moments when families gathered in the evening. The stories spoke of a goddess, an ancient one, who walked the earth during times of great need. She was called Asha, the spirit of abundance and generosity, and she had walked these lands for longer than any human could remember. According to the old tales, Asha tested humanity in times of crisis, walking among them in disguise, observing who still possessed compassion when resources were scarce, who still held to the old ways of kindness when the world tested their hearts. The elders said that she had not been seen in many generations, that perhaps she no longer walked the earth at all, having abandoned humanity to its own devices. But in the hearts of some, hope flickered at the possibility of her return. Obinna, when he heard these stories, laughed aloud. He told his sons that such tales were the fantasies of the weak, stories invented to comfort those who had no power in the real world. He said that if such a goddess existed, he would welcome her into his compound, feed her well, and perhaps she would bless him with even greater wealth. His sons laughed alongside him, and their mockery echoed through the compound like the cries of crows. But Kofi listened differently. Something in the old story stirred something in him, some remembrance of the tales his mother had told him before sleep, back when the world was less harsh and his belly was fuller. He found himself hoping, despite his better judgment, that such a being might exist, and might pass through Katoomba, and might somehow know that not everyone in the village had forgotten the old ways. It was foolish, he knew, but hope was one of the few things he could afford. The day came, as the hottest days have a way of doing, suddenly and without warning. Kofi had been sent to gather water from the river, a task that had become increasingly difficult as the water level dropped. The walk took him through the edge of the forest, past the great baobab trees that stood like ancient guardians, their massive trunks hollowed by centuries of time. The air between the trees was marginally cooler, and it was here, along the path that led toward the river, that Kofi encountered the old woman. She sat beside the path, beneath the spreading branches of the largest baobab tree, and at first Kofi thought she was merely another victim of the drought, one of the many people who had grown too weak to continue moving forward. But as he drew closer, something in the way she was positioned, perfectly upright despite her obvious age, caught his attention. She did not slump as the hungry did. She sat with a kind of dignity that suggested not weakness but rest, as if she had chosen to sit and wait, rather than collapse from exhaustion. Her appearance was unusual. She was very old, certainly the oldest woman Kofi had ever seen. Her skin hung from her bones like cloth that had been washed too many times, thin and fragile. Her hair, which hung in long braids down her back, was completely white, almost silver in the dappled light of the forest. But her eyes were what struck Kofi most forcefully. They were dark and luminous, and they held a quality of seeing that made him feel, for a moment, as if she could perceive not just his physical form but his very essence, all the thoughts and feelings he carried within himself. She wore a cloth of deep indigo, faded with age, wrapped around her body, and on her feet were sandals so worn that the leather had become translucent in places. She appeared to be traveling, with nothing but a small gourd at her side that might have held water. "Child," she said as Kofi approached, her voice like wind moving through a canyon, like something that had traveled a great distance to reach him. "You are making for the river?" Kofi nodded, not trusting himself to speak. There was something about this woman that made him want to be careful, to measure his words. "Will you tell me," she continued, "what you find there? Is there water still?" The question was odd, the kind of question that someone who had lived in Katoomba would not ask, someone who would know what the river contained. Kofi answered truthfully. "There is water still, grandmother, but very little. It is shallow now, and the flow is slow. Many people come to draw from it, and there is often waiting." The old woman nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already known. "It is the same everywhere," she said, more to herself than to him. "The drought spreads its fingers over all the land, and the water retreats to where it cannot be easily found. Tell me, child, do you have family in the village?" Again, Kofi answered honestly, though the question brought a familiar ache to his chest. "My parents are in the spirit realm, grandmother. I live with my uncle's family, but I am not truly of them." Something shifted in the old woman's expression, a kind of gentle sadness. "I see," she said. "That is often the way of those who walk difficult paths. Separation comes early, and it carves something into the heart." She paused, and her eyes remained fixed on his face. "What is your name, child?" "I am called Kofi, grandmother." "Kofi," she repeated, as if the name held some special significance. "A name of birth, a name of arrival. Tell me, Kofi, have you eaten today?" The question caught him unprepared, and for a moment, he could not decide what to say. To admit hunger felt like admitting weakness, and yet, he had already admitted so much to this stranger. And there was something in her expression that suggested that lying to her would be not just wrong but impossible, as if she could see through any false words he might construct. "No, grandmother," he said quietly. "I have not eaten since yesterday, and there was very little even then." The old woman reached down beside her, to the small gourd he had noticed earlier. From it, she removed something wrapped in a cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, and Kofi saw, with a shock that traveled through his entire body, a portion of food. It was not much. It was a small ball of fufu made from pounded yams, and beside it was a small portion of stew, rich with vegetables and, if his nose did not deceive him, meat. The smell of it reached him across the distance between them, and his body responded involuntarily, his mouth flooding with saliva, his stomach clenching with an almost painful longing. "I have brought food for my journey," the old woman said. "More than an old woman of my size truly requires. I found it burdensome to carry. Would you take it from me, child? You look as though you have need of it far more than I do." Kofi's first instinct was to refuse. He had been taught, in the old ways that his mother had shared before she passed, that one did not take food from strangers, that one did not accept gifts without understanding the obligations they might entail. And more than that, he looked at the old woman's thin frame, at the way her age sat upon her like a weight, and he understood that she herself was hungry, that she herself was traveling through a land that had no abundance to offer anyone. "I cannot take your food, grandmother," he said, and it cost him more to say these words than any words he had ever spoken. "You yourself have the look of someone who goes without. It would be wrong for me to take what you need to survive." The old woman studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. It was like watching a door open, like watching a light emerge from darkness. Her face, which had seemed merely ancient and worn, now seemed to glow with something that transcended the physical. "Oh," she said softly, and there was wonder in her voice. "Oh, Kofi, how rare you are. How precious." She held the food toward him again, and this time there was something different in her posture, something that suggested she was not merely offering food but offering something far greater, something that could not be refused without consequence. "Please," she said. "It would bring me great joy to know that you have eaten. This is not a question of my survival, child. I assure you of this. This food is offered freely, with no expectation of return. It is given because giving it brings me pleasure, because in your refusal to take what you desperately need, I have seen something that has not been shown to me in many years. Take it. Eat. Let me know that such kindness still exists in this world, that there are still those who would go hungry rather than take from another, who is also hungry." Something in her words resonated with a part of Kofi that had grown silent during his years of hardship. It was a small voice that whispered that he was not merely a servant, that his life had value, that his capacity for kindness mattered. And slowly, with the reverence of one approaching a sacred thing, he reached out and took the food from her hands. He did not eat it immediately. Instead, he held it in his hands, feeling the warmth of it, feeling the reality of it, as if he needed to confirm that it was not a vision, not a hunger-induced dream. "Thank you," he said simply, and the words felt inadequate to the magnitude of the gift. "Thank you," the old woman replied. "You have given me something far more nourishing than food could ever be. You have given me faith that my journey through this land is not in vain." Kofi sat down beside her, there beneath the great baobab tree, and he ate the food she had given him. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, making it last, even as his body screamed at him to consume it rapidly, to ensure it was inside him before something could take it away. The fufu was perfectly made, light and not too dense, with a subtle flavor of butter or palm oil. The stew was rich with flavor, the vegetables soft and the meat tender. It was the best food Kofi had ever tasted, and he understood as he ate that part of what made it so delicious was the love with which it had been prepared, and the freedom with which it had been given. When he had finished, the old woman asked him about the village, about the drought, about Obina and his hoarding of grain. Kofi answered her questions, and with each answer, he found himself speaking things he had never voiced to anyone else. He spoke of his loneliness, of his uncle's cruelty disguised as practicality, of the way kindness had been beaten out of almost everyone he knew, replaced by a desperate scramble for survival. The old woman listened without judgment, and when he had finished speaking, she placed one of her ancient, papery hands on his head and she said, "You have a good heart, Kofi. Remember this always, even when the world tells you otherwise. Remember that you kept your goodness even when hunger might have made you cruel. This is not a small thing. This is not a thing that goes unnoticed." As the sun began to move lower in the sky, Kofi realized that he needed to return to his uncle's compound with water, or there would be punishment. He rose reluctantly, understanding somehow that something significant had shifted in his encounter with this old woman, that the world was somehow different than it had been when he left his uncle's house that morning. "Will I see you again, grandmother?" he asked. The old woman smiled, and her smile seemed to contain infinite sadness and infinite joy at once. "Perhaps," she said. "The world is smaller than people think, and journeys have a way of looping back on themselves. Go now. Do not keep those who depend on water waiting." Kofi filled his water pots at the river, which despite its diminishment still provided enough for the household's needs. As he carried the pots back toward the compound, he found himself thinking constantly of the old woman, replaying the conversation in his mind, marveling at the kindness she had shown him and the unexpected respect with which she had treated him. But it was not until the next day, when the news began to spread through Katoomba like wind carrying seeds, that Kofi began to understand that something extraordinary had occurred. The drought broke. Not gradually as droughts often do, tapering away into increasing clouds and occasional showers. The drought broke suddenly, dramatically, with a storm of such intensity and such precise duration that it seemed almost orchestrated by the gods themselves. The rains fell for exactly 2 days and 2 nights, enough to refill the well, enough to soak deep into the earth and revive the withering crops, enough to make the river run full and strong once more. And then the rain stopped, and the sun emerged from behind clouds that dissipated like breath from a mirror. But this was not the most remarkable thing that occurred. The most remarkable thing was that Obina fell gravely ill. It began the morning after the first night of rain. The merchant woke complaining of a burning sensation in his eyes, of colors seeming strange and distorted, of his vision becoming unclear. By midday, he had taken to his bed, and by evening, his fever had become so high that his family began to fear for his life. Healers and wise women came to his compound, mixtures and herbs were prepared, prayers were said, but nothing seemed to affect the illness. More strange still, the illness seemed to affect him specifically. His wife, his sons, his servants, even the animals in his compound remained healthy, as if the sickness had sought him out deliberately and had no interest in anyone else. Days passed, and Obina's condition worsened. The fever did not break. More troubling still, he began to speak in the darkness, words that seemed to come from a place beyond conscious thought. He spoke of visions of an old woman with eyes like starlight, of food he had refused to share, of hunger he had ignored, of choices made and a karmic debt that had come due. His family thought he was delirious, the ramblings of fever. But Kofi understood, with a certainty that came from a place beyond knowledge, what had occurred. It took 3 weeks for Obinna to recover. When he finally rose from his bed, he was a changed man, physically diminished but spiritually transformed. The fever had burned away something essential in him, his hoarding instinct, his conviction that wealth was meant to be guarded from those in need. That very day, he ordered his stores of grain opened. He called the people of Katoomba to come and take what they needed. He set no prices. He asked for no payment. And when the work of distribution was complete, he sent for Kofi. The boy came reluctantly, unsure if this was another test, another form of cruelty wearing a different face. But what he found in his uncle's eyes was something he did not recognize at first because he had never seen it before. It was something like remorse and something like understanding. "Kofi," Obinna said, and his voice was different, humbler, stripped of the arrogance that had always characterized it. "I have learned something during my illness, something that my eyes were blinded to before. You came to my house hungry and remained kind. You saw the suffering of others and your heart ached for them, even as your own belly was empty. I did not see this. I did not want to see it." He paused, and Kofi saw that his uncle's eyes had filled with tears. "The woman who came to the village, the old woman, did you see her?" Kofi's heart began to race. "I spoke with her, uncle. By the baobab tree." "Then you know," Obinna said. "You know who she was, what she is." "I think I know," Kofi replied quietly, "though I did not understand it at the time." Obinna nodded slowly. "She came to me too, in my fever. But I did not receive her with kindness as you did. I did not share with her. She asked me for food and I turned her away. I thought she was merely an old beggar, a woman of no consequence. But she was Asha, the goddess of abundance, the ancient one who tests the hearts of humans in times of need." He looked at Kofi, and his expression was one of profound humility. "And you, my nephew, passed a test that I failed. You had nothing and you would have given it. I had everything, and I refused to share even the smallest portion." From that day forward, the relationship between Kofi and his uncle transformed entirely. Obinna recognized in the boy something that he recognized in himself now, or rather, the part of himself that he was striving to become. He brought Kofi into his household not as a servant but as a son, equal in status to his own children. He ensured that he received an education, that he learned the ways of commerce, that he was prepared for a life of greater opportunity than he could have imagined during his years of hardship. But more than material things, Obinna gave Kofi something intangible and far more precious. He gave him a father's recognition, a father's love, an acknowledgement that the boy's inherent worthiness had never depended on his labor or his utility, but existed as a fundamental truth about who he was. Years passed, and Kofi grew into a man of both wisdom and compassion. When he inherited his uncle's business, he ran it differently than Obinna had in those early days. He was fair in his dealings, generous to those in need, and he never forgot the hunger he had known, the clarity that deprivation had given him about what truly matters in the world. And sometimes when he traveled into the forest, past the great baobab trees, he would encounter signs that made him wonder if the old woman had ever truly left the land at all, or if she still walked, still tested hearts, still observed to see who among humanity had not forgotten the ancient ways of kindness. The story of Kofi and the goddess spread throughout the region, told by griots and grandmothers, passed from generation to generation. Some versions grew more elaborate, adding magical transformations and dramatic confrontations. But the essential truth remained the same, unchanged by the embellishments and alterations that time and storytelling always bring. The truth was this: in a time of scarcity, a boy with nothing chose to recognize the personhood and need of another, even when recognizing it meant he would remain hungry. And in that choice, in that refusal to abandon kindness despite the pressure of circumstances to do so, something sacred was honored. Something ancient and divine, the very principle of compassion that holds the world together, was acknowledged and returned his kindness exponentially, restoring not just his circumstances but his entire understanding of what his life could be. This is the lesson that has echoed down through generations since the days of Katoomba. a lesson that speaks to something fundamental about human nature and the nature of the divine. It says that kindness is not weakness, that generosity is not foolishness, that the recognition of another's humanity is perhaps the highest calling that any person can answer. It says that the gods, or whatever cosmic force drives the universe forward, are watching always, testing always, waiting to see who among humanity will maintain the old ways of respect and compassion, even when the world seems to reward only greed and hoarding. And it says that those who pass this test, who keep their hearts open even in the face of deprivation, receive rewards that cannot be measured in material goods alone, rewards that touch something eternal within the human spirit. The people of Katoomba never forgot the dry season when the drought was broken by rain, and by the fever that came to Obina. They understood, after that the old stories were not merely stories, that the gods and goddesses did indeed walk among them, and that their actions, their choices, the way they treated the strangers who came to their doors, all of it mattered in ways that extended far beyond the immediate moment. And perhaps this is the greatest gift that any folktale can offer, the reminder that we are never truly alone, that we are always being observed by something greater than ourselves, and that our capacity for kindness, even in the moments when it costs us most deeply, even in the times when our own need is greatest, this capacity is sacred and will be honored by forces greater than we can see. If you have found your way to this story, if these words about a boy and a goddess have touched your heart, consider taking a moment to reflect on your own encounters with kindness, your own moments of giving or receiving compassion in times of need. These stories are not merely ancient words meant to entertain. They are mirrors in which we see ourselves, and invitations to embody the virtues they celebrate. Feel free to share this tale with others, to let it travel as the griots have always allowed their stories to travel, from mouth to ear, from heart to heart. And if you wish to hear more stories like this one, stories that touch the eternal truths woven through the fabric of African tradition and wisdom, please consider subscribing to this channel, so that more of these ancient voices can reach you, and through you, touch the world with their timeless messages of hope and transformation.